Hello and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today we want to talk about gathering, right? And so when you look at primary activities, you can really divide them into two groups, gathering and extracting. And so today we want to talk about this, and this is different than foraging. Like when we think hunter-gatherer, we think of a forager. And gathering in this case, in terms of primary activities, yes, foraging would be a primary activity, but we're talking about doing something more intentional. And today we want to focus on fishing and forestry. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about economic geography, because primary, secondary, whatever activities, this how you make a living, can be analyzed using economic geography. And basically what you look at is the physical environment, the cultural conditions, the technology that is available, and then the political and economic system. So one of the things that when you're looking at economic geography that you ask yourself is, how does that vary by place, and how does it connect places? So, types of economies, what are they? And we'll be talking more about economic systems later when we start talking about development and trade and exchange. Well, trade is exchange. Types of economies, we've talked a lot about subsistence economies, and that is where the bulk of the goods and services are produced for the use of the family or the producers, whoever that may be. Okay? That can graduate into a commercial economy where the producers are supplying markets. Sometimes you have a combination, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. But basically, this is where you're looking at selling things, supply and demand, competition, all of those principles come up. And then you have a planned economy, which is where the government controls the prices. Okay, so you don't have a free market, right? It's entirely run by the government. So subsistence, commercial, planned, and again, we'll come back to these later on. But I do want to point out that subsistence is not something that we've had like strictly for the family. Most subsistence producers really want to produce enough to survive, but then also some to trade or sell. And so you have mixed economies, which are mostly subsistence and some commercial, right? You know, half and half, whatever. Now, the systems are subject to change depending on markets and globalization, and again, we'll be talking about that later on, but one of the key variables is going to be transportation, okay? When you are connected to other places, then you have the ability to trade more, right? Isolation restricts access to the outside world, and in isolated communities, you're going to find lots of subsistence economies. In connected communities or societies, you're going to have a lot more commercial economy. Okay. Just to point out, very few people are actually members of only one type of economic system. Okay, so when we talk about economic activities, I said that we were going to talk about primary today and next time. And so primary economic activities, these are the ones that are directly involved with the natural resources. They're also generally the lowest income, which is, I think, interesting. We'll talk about that later on. The secondary activities are going to be the value-added activities. That's going to be the manufacturing. And so next time, we're going to continue on with primary economic activities, and then we're going to shift into secondary, okay? Tertiary, these are going to be services that support primary or secondary activities, and then the quaternary services or activities are the information-based services, okay? And so when you look at that, you can see primary activities are agriculture, gathering, which was the fishing and the forestry, extractive, which is getting mineral resources, metals, things like that. Secondary activities, manufacturing, processing, construction, power production, okay, because you need power to do all these things. Tertiary activities, this is going to be the retail and wholesale trade. This is where you're going to sell these sorts of goods, right, or even these goods as the case may be. It's also going to be your personal and professional services, okay, so these are going to be all the support industries, schools, doctors, whatever, okay. Then you move into the quaternary activities, and that's going to be your research, information management, okay, so you know exactly what it sounds like. And then your quinary activities, and we didn't talk about this on the other slide. This is kind of a, you know, maybe not, you could divide a smaller subset of quaternary activities into these quinary activities, and that would be like CEOs, CFOs, COOs, things like that. So chief executive officers, chief financial officers, chief operating officers, the executive decision makers, if you will. All right, here's your first question. In rural areas, the majority of people work in trade and manufacturing, are economically dependent on cities, are involved in harvesting natural resources, work in goods exchange, or work in information exchange. Well, in rural areas, most of the time, you're going to find people who are harvesting, right? A lot of times, it's actually agriculture. Yeah, so that is going to be a primary activity. Primary activities will be the bulk of rural areas, right? Gathering industries, agriculture, fishing, forestry. Again, remember, we're talking about commercial versus subsistence. Just because it's a primary economic activity does not make it subsistence. And most of these things are potentially renewable resources when you're talking about the gathering industry. And ideally, you're trying to do this at the maximum sustainable yield. This is not something we've done historically all the time, most of the time. But this is really, if we're going to sustain gathering industries, this is the way that we have to gather, is making sure that we are sustainable and that we're maintaining it for future generations as well. So we look at primary activities around the world. You can see, and I like this map, and this may be a little bit tricky, but here's the United States, right? There's Canada. South America, right? Here's Asia, so that's Russia, China, here's Australia, and then here's Africa, right? That's Madagascar down here. Here's the Middle East. So you're really looking from the poles, and I think this is just a cool, there's a reason that you're looking at this map, because you can see that mostly in developing nations or nations with large rural areas like China, you have huge primary economic sectors. That's what I want. But the secondary point of this map is I think it's an interesting way to look at the Earth from that kind of top view. Okay, so here's your next question. The development of early civilizations usually depended on a plentiful water supply and fertile land, the formation of democratic governments, a location near large deposits of gold and silver, or the existence of large armies. Well, early civilizations are going to depend on what they can gather, what they can collect, and that means you're going to need to have access to water, and you're going to need to have land that you can grow things in. Formation of governments comes as people settle, right? And as you start talking about extracting, which we're going to talk about next time, gold and silver can be helpful, but they're not nearly as important as, say, copper or iron. All right, and armies protect you, so there you go. Now, I want to put this map in here because I want to show you, really, when you start looking at where people live, you find out that oftentimes you have some of the largest settlements on the coast of these very nice warm currents, right? And here is our own Gulf Stream right here that flows past Northern Europe, right? That keeps this all milder than it could be otherwise. So you have this nice warm currents. Here you have a cool current, and here you have a cool current. Interesting thing about this is that you can get different benefits from both of those, right? Really robust fishing industry here off the coast of Peru because of the way these currents flow, and then you have warm water coming back in. And you've got, of course, the currents that you can use to help you trade and stuff like, stuff like that. But you can see these major fishing areas, and a good many of them have to do with these nice warm currents, right? Occasionally you'll get the cool currents, and that has to do with upwelling. But mostly it's going to be these nice warm currents. Okay, so fisheries, really you get the main protein source for about 1 billion people, just over 1 billion people, comes from fisheries. And there's some inland fishing, we're talking about lakes and rivers. Aquaculture has become huge, and so there are lots of fish that are being farmed now. But the ocean still supplies over 2/3 of our fish, and unfortunately the bulk of the fisheries in the ocean are actually threatened or vulnerable, overfished, right? They're either depleted or near depletion, things like that. And so we face a really huge struggle going forward as our technology increases and we are able to access fish in large quantities. And we'll actually talk about the cod later on, because the cod is an interesting story about sustainable yield, trade, and international relations. So anyway, fisheries, really one of the most basic things. We've been fishing for a really long time. Okay. So what about forests? We get a lot of resources from forests, and when we start looking at just the wood itself, typically you're going to divide it into two categories. You're going to look at commercial use, so like your coniferous trees for paper and lumber, your hardwoods for other things, more decorative things like furniture, and then your tropical hardwoods those are going to be your exotic woods like teak and mahogany and things like that. And you use those for decoration, furniture, but also in the developing world, it's used for fuel wood. Okay, so lots of uses for wood. We still rely heavily on it. Unfortunately, the downside of that is that a lot of land gets cleared, and sometimes the intention is to clear the land, especially if you're clearing it for agriculture. But this used to be a forest, as you can see. You can see all of these trees that have cut down, and so now it's just a big field. So that is one of the things that we have to be careful about, is overuse of our forests, because they take a fairly long time to grow. And when we look at forests around the world, you can see that there are lots of coniferous forests, and the majority of coniferous forests actually are pretty well maintained. But you'll notice that the coniferous forests are typically in developed nations, okay, where you do have forest management. That is true for the deciduous and the mixed coniferous, but the deciduous forests as well. They typically are going to be in developed nations, right? And so they're going to be managed. The tropical and subtropical hardwoods, what we're talking about here is we're talking about the trees in the rainforest. They are not managed. They are disappearing at a radical rate. Okay, as a matter of fact, Central America has lost somewhere around 70%. Asia has lost about 50%. Africa about 50%, and South America about 40%. Brazil is a huge player in that loss of tropical forest. But what's happening is the land is under pressure from the growing population, and what they need to do with the land is make food. So two things happen. One, you can cut down all the trees and sell those and make a profit, but that's a one-time deal. You could also not make a profit on the wood, but you could cut it down and burn it, slash and burn, and that puts nutrients into the soil. Once you do that, you can farm on it, and that's going to give you the opportunity to grow crops. Now, it's very short-lived because tropical soils are very nutrient poor. That's why they burn the trees to put the nutrients in. But once you use all those nutrients, you can only rely on fertilizer after that, and productivity goes down. Now, the other thing that you can do with that cleared land is you can raise beef. And beef, cows, much more profitable than timber, and it's a food source. And so we are losing tropical forests to agriculture and rangeland. Rangeland is where you raise livestock. So what are some other benefits of tropical forests, and why should we care? I mean, we don't talk a lot about, like I said, the coniferous and the deciduous forests, because those are managed, right? We're not losing those at some sort of horrible, alarming rate. But tropical forests, they're also a carbon sink. And as carbon increases in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, the trees absorb it. The ocean absorbs it too, but that's a totally different story. But trees are really important plants. Vegetation is really important to helping clear out the CO2 from the atmosphere. We put in more CO2 into the atmosphere, and we cut down more trees. And so that is having an effect. Essentially, deforestation exacerbates the problem. Now, the other thing that you want to keep in mind is that the rainforests are the second largest oxygen producer behind the ocean. And so as you cut down trees, you're cutting down oxygen production. And 50% of known species live in rainforests, and there are lots of species that we have not discovered yet. We're discovering them all the time. And one of the big places that we discover new species is in the rainforest. And we get a huge number of medical resources and cosmetics, actually, from the rainforest. I think over something like, 25% or a third of all pharmaceuticals actually still come directly from plants in the rainforest, the tropical forest. And then we've been able to produce synthetically some other things that have been discovered in tropical forests. So it's huge. It's a big loss. Ecotourism is interesting because it's a benefit in that you bring in money to the economies in these areas which are developing, but also there's a push to maintain these ecosystems because that's what tourists come to see. There's a downside to it too, as there is with any tourism, but really one of the best hopes for tropical forests is ecotourism. All right, now that brings us to the idea of the tragedy of the commons. One of the things that we really have issues with is common spaces. Resources typically, it depends on the resource, but lots of resources are accessible to everybody, but they don't belong to anybody. And so it's important that we pull together as a community and maintain these resources if we want to actually have any sort of sustainable future. And so you can see here, look at the air, right? The air belongs to everybody, but Los Angeles is not taking a really good care of it, even though this pollution drifts someplace else. In China, their pollution drifts to the west coast of the United States. And so it's important that everybody takes responsibility, and that can be for anything. I mean, hunting is a totally reasonable thing to do, and lots of people actually survive on hunting. But if you don't recognize that there's a certain number of animals that can be hunted, and you just hunt like the bison, you just out hunt them, you won't have them in the future. And so sustainable hunting is a very important thing. And also keeping things clean, not throwing your trash in the park, right? It's not your park. You get to play there, right? But if you leave trash, now that's everybody's problem. So anyway, so there's just a little bit on, we definitely change, and this is how we impact geography. We change what's going on around us, and it's very important that we are mindful not to destroy these resources. Alrighty, so that is it about our primary activities for today. We'll move on to extracting later on. If you have any questions, please ask me at the beginning of class, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.